Picture this. You're scrolling through old newspaper headlines from the 1920s, and one catches your eye. Military mastermind terrorizes banks across America. What if I told you that behind those headlines was a man whose battlefield expertise didn't end when he hung up his uniform? What if I told you his story would fundamentally change how we think about crime, security, and the thin line between heroism and infamy? Today we're diving into the extraordinary tale of a European war veteran whose tactical brilliance earned him a place in American folklore, though not in the way he probably imagined when he first set foot on Ellis Island. This is the story of how military precision met criminal ambition, and how one man's quest for the American dream became a nightmare that would reshape law enforcement forever. But before we unlock this incredible story, let me tell you about something that's been kept classified for decades. If you're fascinated by the hidden stories behind history's most intriguing figures, you need to check out my other channel, Shadow Archives. Every week, we uncover the classified files, the buried reports, and the forgotten testimonies that reveal the truth behind the legends. These aren't just stories, they're the missing pieces of history that governments hoped would stay buried. Hit that subscribe button and join us as we expose what they never wanted you to know. The year was 1890, and in the heart of the German Empire, a child was born who would one day revolutionize American crime. Herman Lamm, though history would know him by a different name, entered the world in Kassel, a city where military tradition ran deeper than the rivers that carved through its landscape. But this isn't your typical origin story. Young Herman wasn't destined for greatness from birth. In fact, his early years suggested quite the opposite. While other boys his age were playing with toy soldiers, Herman was already displaying the cunning that would later define his legacy. He had an uncanny ability to see patterns where others saw chaos, to identify weaknesses in seemingly impenetrable systems. When Herman came of age, the German military machine welcomed him with open arms. The Prussian military tradition wasn't just about marching in formation or following orders. It was about creating thinking soldiers, men who could adapt, improvise, and overcome. Herman excelled in ways that both impressed and concerned his superiors. You see, military training in early 1900s Germany was like attending the world's most exclusive business school, except instead of learning about market strategies, you learned about human psychology, tactical planning, and operational security. Herman absorbed these lessons like a sponge, but with one crucial difference: he began to see applications far beyond the battlefield. His instructors taught him that successful military operations required three essential elements: intelligence gathering, precise timing, and flawless execution. They showed him how to study enemy positions, identify their weaknesses, and exploit them with surgical precision. They drilled into him the importance of having multiple escape routes, contingency plans, and the ability to adapt when things went wrong. What they didn't realize was that Herman was mentally cataloging every technique, every strategy, every psychological trick they taught him. While his fellow soldiers saw these as tools for serving their country, Herman saw them as blueprints for something entirely different. But Herman had a fatal flaw, one that would eventually cost him his military career and set him on a path that would make him infamous. He couldn't resist the temptation to use his growing tactical knowledge for personal gain. Card games among soldiers were common, but Herman approached them like military campaigns. He would study his opponents, identify their tells, and exploit their weaknesses with the same methodical precision he applied to battlefield tactics. The problem wasn't just that he was winning, it was how he was winning. His fellow soldiers began to notice patterns, behaviors that suggested Herman wasn't just lucky or skilled at cards. He was applying military intelligence techniques to civilian gambling. He was, in essence, treating his comrades like enemy combatants to be studied, analyzed, and defeated. This created a poisonous atmosphere within his unit. Military effectiveness depends on trust, on the absolute certainty that the man next to you will risk everything to protect you. When that trust is broken, when soldiers begin to suspect that their comrade sees them as marks rather than brothers, the entire foundation of military discipline begins to crumble. Herman's commanding officers faced a dilemma. On one hand, they had a soldier with exceptional tactical abilities, someone who could potentially become a valuable leader. On the other hand, they had a man who had demonstrated that he was willing to exploit his military training for personal gain at the expense of unit cohesion. The final straw came during a particularly heated card game. Several soldiers had accused Herman of cheating, and what started as accusations quickly escalated into a full-blown brawl. When the dust settled, Herman found himself facing a court-martial board that had grown tired of his antics. In 1914, as Europe teetered on the brink of the most devastating war in human history, Herman Lamm was dishonorably discharged from the German army. The irony wasn't lost on him. While millions of his former countrymen were about to march off to die in the trenches, he was being expelled from the very institution that had given him his most valuable education. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Instead of seeing his discharge as a defeat, Herman saw it as an opportunity. He had spent years learning from some of the world's most skilled military strategists, and now he was free to apply those lessons without the constraints of military discipline or national loyalty. With war clouds gathering over Europe, Herman made a decision that would alter the course of his life forever. He would leave Germany behind and seek his fortune in America, the land of opportunity, where a man with the right skills and determination could build an empire. What Herman didn't realize was that he was about to become an unwitting pioneer, the architect of techniques that would influence American crime for generations to come. His military training, combined with his tactical mindset and complete lack of moral constraints, was about to collide with the freewheeling capitalism of 1920s America. Ellis Island had seen millions of dreamers pass through its halls, but few arrived with the unique combination of skills and ambition that Herman Lamm possessed. The year was 1914, and America was still clinging to its neutrality as Europe descended into chaos. For Herman, this timing couldn't have been more perfect or more challenging. You have to understand the America that Herman encountered. This wasn't the melting pot of cultures that we sometimes imagine. This was a nation rapidly transforming, where industrialization was creating unprecedented wealth for some while, leaving others behind. It was a country where your success often depended not just on your skills, but on your ability to navigate complex social hierarchies and cultural expectations. Herman arrived with virtually nothing, a few personal belongings, some money, and a head full of military tactics that seemed utterly useless in civilian life. But he also brought something that most immigrants lacked, a systematic approach to problem solving that had been honed by years of military training. His first challenge was the language barrier. Herman's English was rudimentary at best, and his thick German accent immediately marked him as an outsider. But this wasn't just about communication, it was about survival. As anti-German sentiment began to rise in America, Herman found himself facing a level of hostility that went far beyond typical immigrant struggles. The sinking of the Lusitania in 1915 changed everything. Suddenly, anyone with a German accent wasn't just a foreigner, they were a potential enemy. German Americans found themselves under suspicion, their businesses boycotted, their communities ostracized. Some were even attacked by vigilante groups, who saw them as threats to American security. Herman watched as his countrymen changed their names, abandoned their cultural traditions, and did everything possible to blend into American society. But Herman had a different response. Instead of trying to assimilate, he began to see American society as a system to be analyzed and exploited, just like the military campaigns he had studied. His first attempts at making an honest living were disasters. The language barrier, combined with growing anti-German sentiment, made it nearly impossible to find steady employment. Factory owners didn't want to hire someone they couldn't communicate with effectively. Shop owners didn't want to deal with customers who might be uncomfortable with a German employee. But Herman's military training had taught him something valuable. When conventional approaches fail, you adapt. Instead of continuing to bang his head against the wall of legitimate employment, Herman began to explore alternative methods of survival. His first crimes were almost pathetically small: petty thefts, minor burglaries, the kind of desperate acts committed by someone who sees no other options. But even in these early criminal endeavors, Herman's military background began to show. While other petty criminals acted on impulse, Herman approached each theft like a tactical operation. He would study his targets, identify their weaknesses, plan his approach, and execute with military precision. A simple burglary became a reconnaissance mission. A pickpocketing operation became an exercise in battlefield awareness and timing. Herman wasn't just stealing, he was applying military science to civilian crime. The problem was scale. Petty theft might keep him fed, but it wasn't going to give him the kind of life he envisioned. Herman had tasted the systematic approach that military training provided, and he knew that there had to be a way to apply those same principles to larger, more profitable endeavors. His luck ran out during a bungled robbery attempt. Herman found himself arrested, processed, and sentenced to a stint in prison. For most criminals, this would have been a setback, a warning to change their ways. For Herman, it became graduate school. Prison in the 1910s wasn't about rehabilitation, it was about punishment and isolation. Inmates were given long hours to sit in their cells and contemplate their choices. Most used this time to feel sorry for themselves or to plan revenge against the system that had imprisoned them. Herman used it to develop the most revolutionary criminal methodology in American history. Sitting in his cell, Herman began to connect the dots between his military training and his criminal activities. He realized that his previous crimes had failed, not because of bad luck, but because of poor planning and execution. He had been thinking like a desperate immigrant rather than like a trained military strategist. What if he could assemble a team of criminals who operated with the same discipline and coordination as a military unit? What if he could apply the intelligence-gathering techniques he had learned in the German army to civilian targets? What if he could bring military-level planning and execution to criminal enterprises? The more Herman thought about it, the more excited he became. Banks, he realized, were like enemy fortifications, heavily defended, but with predictable weaknesses that could be exploited by someone with the right knowledge and resources. The key was to stop thinking like a common criminal and start thinking like a military commander. By the time Herman was released from prison, he had developed a comprehensive strategy that would revolutionize American crime. He had identified the fatal flaws in traditional criminal approaches and designed a system that addressed every weakness. He had, in essence, created a new form of warfare, one where the battlefield was Main Street America and the enemy was the established financial system. But Herman's ambitions went beyond just successful crimes. He wanted to build something lasting, something that would prove that his military training hadn't been wasted. He wanted to create a criminal organization that operated with the same efficiency and effectiveness as the German military units he had once served alongside. What Herman didn't realize was that he was about to become the template for organized crime in America. His techniques would be studied, copied, and refined by criminals for decades to come. He was about to transform from a desperate immigrant into a criminal innovator whose methods would influence law enforcement, banking security, and crime prevention for generations. When Herman Lamm walked out of prison in 1919, America was a different country. The Great War had ended, the economy was booming, and the nation was about to enter the most prosperous decade in its history. Banks were overflowing with cash, security was minimal, and law enforcement was still operating with tactics designed for a simpler time. Herman saw opportunity everywhere he looked. But more importantly, he saw a system that was vulnerable to someone with his unique combination of military training and criminal ambition. The traditional approach to bank robbery was laughably primitive. One or two men would burst through the doors, wave guns around, grab whatever cash they could find, and hope to escape before law enforcement arrived. It was chaos disguised as crime. Herman's approach would be different. He would bring military precision to criminal enterprise, creating a system so sophisticated that it would take law enforcement years to develop effective countermeasures. He would, in essence, declare war on the American banking system, and he would win more battles than anyone thought possible. The first element of Herman's revolutionary approach was intelligence gathering. In the military, successful operations began with detailed reconnaissance of enemy positions, capabilities, and weaknesses. Herman applied this same principle to banking, but with a twist that demonstrated his criminal genius. Instead of conducting obvious surveillance that might alert his targets, Herman developed cover stories that allowed him to gather intelligence while appearing to be a legitimate businessman. He would pose as a security consultant, claiming to represent a company that specialized in bank protection systems. Bank managers, eager to learn about the latest security innovations, would happily provide detailed tours of their facilities. Herman would examine every aspect of the bank's operations, the location of the vault, the number of employees, the security measures in place, the daily routines that governed the facility. He would note the times when customer traffic was heaviest and lightest, when employees took breaks, when guards changed shifts. He was creating detailed intelligence reports that would have impressed his former military commanders. But Herman's intelligence gathering went far beyond the physical layout of the banks. He would study the surrounding neighborhoods, mapping police stations, identifying patrol routes, and calculating response times. He would analyze traffic patterns, looking for the fastest escape routes and the most effective ways to avoid law enforcement. His associates would pose as location scouts for Hollywood film productions, claiming to be searching for authentic locations for upcoming movies. This cover story allowed them to ask detailed questions about the bank's history, its busiest times, and even to take photographs of the interior and exterior. Bank managers, flattered by the attention and excited about the possibility of their institution being featured in a film, would cooperate enthusiastically. The second element of Herman's system was team selection and training. Military units succeeded because every member had specific skills and responsibilities, and because they trained together until they could function as a seamless unit. Herman applied this same principle to criminal recruitment. Instead of working with whatever criminals happened to be available, Herman carefully selected team members based on their specific abilities and psychological profiles. He wanted disciplined individuals who could follow orders, remain calm under pressure, and execute complex plans without improvisation or deviation. His recruitment process was like a military selection board. Herman would identify potential candidates in prisons, criminal hangouts, and other locations where he could observe their behavior under stress. He was looking for specific qualities: the ability to remain calm in dangerous situations, the discipline to follow detailed instructions, and the intelligence to adapt when plans went awry. Once he had assembled his team, Herman would subject them to training that resembled military preparation more than criminal planning. He would create detailed scale models of target banks, forcing his team members to rehearse their roles until they could execute them flawlessly. He would run timing exercises, teaching his men to coordinate their actions with stopwatch precision. Each team member had a specific role that played to their strengths. The lobbyman was responsible for controlling the public areas of the bank, maintaining order among customers and employees while the operation unfolded. The vaultman had the technical skills needed to access the bank's most secure areas. The lookout served as the team's eyes and ears, watching for approaching threats and coordinating communications. But perhaps the most important team member was the getaway driver. Herman realized that escape was often the most dangerous part of any bank robbery, and he recruited drivers with skills that went far beyond simply knowing how to operate a vehicle. He wanted men who could handle high-performance cars at dangerous speeds, who could navigate complex urban environments under pressure, and who could make split-second decisions that could mean the difference between freedom and capture. Herman found his ideal drivers at racetracks, where young men with military backgrounds were testing their skills against both machines and each other. These drivers had the reflexes, the courage, and the mechanical knowledge that Herman needed, and many of them were struggling financially in the early days of professional motorsports. The third element of Herman's system was detailed operational planning. Every aspect of the robbery was choreographed in advance, with contingency plans for every possible scenario. Herman would create detailed timeline charts showing exactly when each team member should be in position, when they should begin their specific tasks, and when they should be ready to withdraw. He would identify multiple escape routes, each one carefully mapped and tested under various conditions. His drivers would practice these routes dozens of times, memorizing every turn, every traffic pattern, every potential obstacle. Herman called these alternate routes cat roads, back alleys, side streets, and shortcuts that would allow his team to disappear into the urban landscape before law enforcement could respond effectively. The planning phase could take weeks or even months. Herman would study newspaper reports of other bank robberies, analyzing what had worked and what had failed. He would read police reports when he could get access to them, learning about law enforcement tactics and response procedures. He was essentially conducting a military intelligence operation against the entire American law enforcement system. But Herman's most innovative contribution was his approach to timing and coordination. Military operations succeeded because every element was synchronized, and Herman applied this same principle to bank robbery. His team members carried stopwatches, and every aspect of the operation was timed to the second. They would enter the bank at precisely the right moment, when customer traffic was manageable but not so light that their presence would be immediately noticed. They would complete their tasks according to a rigid schedule that left no room for hesitation or improvisation. They would exit the bank within a predetermined time window, regardless of how much money they had or had not obtained. This systematic approach produced results that amazed both the criminal underworld and law enforcement. Herman's robberies were so well planned and executed that they seemed almost effortless. His teams would enter banks, complete their operations, and disappear before anyone fully understood what had happened. The financial rewards were unprecedented. While traditional bank robbers might escape with a few $100s, Herman's operations regularly netted thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of dollars per robbery. In an era when the average American worker earned less than $1,000 per year, Herman's criminal enterprise was generating wealth that rivaled legitimate business empires. But Herman's success created an unexpected problem. His techniques were so effective that other criminals began to take notice. Within a few years, copycat operations were appearing across the country, all attempting to replicate Herman's military-inspired approach to bank robbery. Herman had inadvertently created a new form of criminal enterprise, one that would challenge American law enforcement for decades to come. By the mid-1920s, Herman Lamm had transformed from a desperate immigrant into something approaching criminal royalty. The newspapers had begun calling him the Baron, and the nickname stuck because it captured something essential about his approach to crime. He wasn't just a bank robber, he was a criminal aristocrat who had elevated theft to an art form. The Baron's reputation spread through the criminal underworld like wildfire. Stories of his perfectly executed heists became legend, passed down through generations of criminals who saw him as the gold standard of professional crime. But what made Herman truly dangerous wasn't just his success, it was his influence on American criminal culture. Herman had proven that crime could be both profitable and sophisticated. His operations generated enormous wealth while maintaining a level of professionalism that impressed even his enemies. He had created a new model for criminal enterprise, one that combined military precision with entrepreneurial ambition. The financial rewards of Herman's operations were staggering. By 1925, his various heists had netted him over $1 million, equivalent to nearly $20 million in today's currency. But Herman wasn't just accumulating money. He was investing it in ways that enhanced his criminal capabilities and protected his organization. He used his wealth to corrupt law enforcement officials, paying bribes that provided advance warning of police investigations. He invested in high-performance vehicles and sophisticated weapons that gave his teams tactical advantages over pursuing officers. He established safe houses and communication networks that allowed his organization to operate across multiple states. But perhaps most importantly, Herman used his wealth to cultivate an image that went far beyond simple criminal success. He became a fixture in high society, attending exclusive events and socializing with legitimate businessmen and politicians. He dressed impeccably, spoke eloquently, and carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never committed a crime in his life. This public persona served multiple purposes. It provided cover for his criminal activities, making it difficult for law enforcement to connect the sophisticated gentleman they saw at social gatherings with the military-trained bank robber they were hunting. It also allowed Herman to gather intelligence about law enforcement activities, as police officials and politicians often discussed their work in social settings. The American public's reaction to Herman's exploits was complex and revealing. In an era when organized crime was dominated by violent gangsters and corrupt politicians, Herman represented something different, a criminal who operated with honor and professionalism. His robberies were carefully planned to minimize violence, and he treated his victims with a respect that was rare in criminal circles. This approach created a strange form of celebrity. Newspaper reporters began writing about Herman's exploits with a mixture of condemnation and admiration. He was portrayed as a modern-day Robin Hood, a sophisticated outlaw who had turned crime into a gentleman's profession. The public, fascinated by his daring and impressed by his success, began to view him as an anti-establishment hero. But Herman's influence extended far beyond public relations. His techniques were being studied and copied by criminal organizations across the country. The military-inspired approach to bank robbery that Herman had pioneered was becoming the standard operating procedure for serious criminals. Law enforcement agencies found themselves facing a new type of criminal, one who operated with the same level of sophistication and coordination as military units. Traditional police tactics, designed to deal with opportunistic criminals and disorganized gangs, were proving inadequate against Herman's systematic approach. The Baron's operations had become so successful that he was able to be selective about his targets. Instead of robbing any bank that seemed vulnerable, Herman would spend months studying potential targets, looking for institutions that offered the right combination of financial reward and tactical challenge. He was no longer just a criminal, he was an artist who chose his canvas carefully. His team members enjoyed a level of prestige within criminal circles that was unprecedented. Being selected for one of Herman's operations was seen as a mark of professional excellence. His associates were well-paid, well-trained, and well-respected among their peers. Herman had created a criminal organization that functioned like an elite military unit. But success brought new challenges. Herman's growing notoriety meant that law enforcement agencies across the country were sharing information about his activities. The FBI, still a relatively new organization, was beginning to develop specialized units dedicated to combating sophisticated criminal operations. Police departments were upgrading their equipment and training to deal with the new generation of criminals that Herman had inspired. They were purchasing faster vehicles, more powerful weapons, and better communication systems. They were also developing new tactics that specifically targeted the systematic approach that Herman had pioneered. The banking industry itself was responding to Herman's success by implementing security measures that hadn't been necessary in previous decades. Banks were installing alarm systems, hiring armed guards, and redesigning their physical layouts to make robbery more difficult. The cat-and-mouse game between criminals and law enforcement was escalating to new levels of sophistication. Herman recognized that his methods would eventually be countered by improved law enforcement techniques, but instead of changing his approach, he decided to double down on the systematic principles that had made him successful. He began planning more ambitious operations, targeting larger banks with more sophisticated security systems. His final operations would be his most daring. Herman had identified a series of banks that represented the ultimate test of his criminal methodology. These institutions were well-defended, well-connected, and well-funded. Successfully robbing them would require every technique he had developed and every lesson he had learned. But Herman's ambition was about to collide with forces beyond his control. Law enforcement agencies had spent years studying his methods, and they were finally ready to implement countermeasures that would test the Baron's legendary skills. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine whether Herman's criminal innovations were genuinely revolutionary or simply the product of temporary law enforcement weaknesses. The Baron's story reminds us that genius can emerge from the most unlikely places, and that the skills we develop in one context can be applied in ways we never anticipated. Herman's military training had been intended to serve his country, but he had used it to wage war against society itself. His tactical brilliance had been meant to protect democracy, but he had used it to challenge the very foundations of law and order. In the end, Herman